welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. And today I'm going to talk about the idea of there having been a Nazi cultural revolution, or an attempt at a cultural revolution, during the period 1933 to 1939. Now, this is a strange and often overused term, but with a notion that's slightly different to the Stalinist and Maoist cultural revolutions, which were an attempt to harness, to connect Stalin and Mao with the population at large and try to bypass the growing issue of bureaucratization of the revolution, as both individuals saw it, the idea to create a kind of Marxist-Leninist and Maoist populism, if you will. Hitler, the Nazi kind of cultural revolution, was an attempt to fundamentally reshape Germany, along racial lines, but also along cultural and intellectual lines. Simply put, to alter how German people thought and felt about the social reality around them, to take people that perhaps didn't initially think in explicitly racial terms and present them with little alternative but to embrace racial thinking and embrace notions of Volk and Reich and of the taxonomy of races wholeheartedly. Joseph Goebbels said that basically the Nazi revolution would be a complete and full revolution, and there would be no bystanders, no people reluctantly accepting the verdict of January 1933. Instead, there would be people who would be encouraged to and forced to become active participants in building a new Germany. Now, today I'm reading from Noakes and Pridham, Nazism, a documentary reader, Volume 2, State, Economy and Society. And the trilogy of Noakes and Pridham documentary readers really are some of the best things that have ever been written on the subject of Nazi Germany. Noakes and Pridham write, "In the eyes of the Nazis, their seizure of power in 1933 was more than just a change of government. It represented merely the start of a revolution which would transform German society in accordance with their ideology." Speaking to the party faithful in September 1933 at his first Nazi rally at Nuremberg after the seizure of power, Hitler distinguished between the political and ideological revolution. And here is a quote directly from Hitler. "On the 30th of January 1933, the National Socialist Party was entrusted with the political leadership of the Reich. At the end of March, the National Socialist Revolution was completed on the external plane," by which, of course, he is talking about the process of consolidation of power, the purge of the communists and the social democrats, the Enabling Act, and the March election. Completed so far as regards the entire takeover of political power. But only those who have not fully comprehended the character of this tremendous struggle can believe that the struggle between ideologies has thereby come to an end. This would be so if the National Socialist movement wanted nothing other than the ordinary parties. These do indeed seem to reach the peak of their ambition and therefore of their existence on the day of the takeover of political power. Ideologies, however, see in the achievement of political power only the prerequisite for the beginning of the fulfillment of their real mission. The word ideology already contains the solemn proclamation of the decision to base all actions upon a particular initial position, and therefore a clear orientation. Such an attitude may be right or wrong. It is the basis for the attitude to be adopted towards all the phenomena and processes of life, and therefore is a law which binds and determines all action. So here we go deep into Hitler's own thinking. Hitler saw all politics as essentially redundant. He saw most philosophy, most ideology as essentially redundant. All things were redundant in the face of one truth, and that was the truth of racial struggle in his eyes, that all history was defined by it, just as Marx had argued that all history was defined by class struggle. Hitler said that the point of any political party seizing power was to implement ideology, in this case racial ideology, and that racial ideology was more important than any other consideration, and that the workings of the state, which is what the party had seized control of, would now be bent towards fulfilling this goal. In a way, he's saying that the first phase of the seizure of power, the elimination of the communists, and the destruction of parliamentary democracy using the Enabling Act, was really just the very beginnings. That was the easy bit, in some ways the trivial bit. And now the long struggle, as Hitler saw it, was a struggle for changing attitudes and beliefs. Hitler believed that this would be a generational struggle, and it would be the young people in Germany who would carry his revolution forwards. Hitler believed that people of his generation, the good ones, had either all been killed in the First World War, which again suggests that for Hitler and many Nazis like him, there was a great deal of almost survivor's guilt, but a kind of survivor's remorse that the glorious death had been missed, and that somehow the more inadequate members of adult German society plodded on. Those that had not fought in the First World War, but who had kind of grown up through Weimar, Hitler viewed as having been almost completely corrupted by Weimar. They were in possession of the wrong kinds of ideas, the wrong kinds of beliefs, the wrong kinds of attitudes, and some he thought were irretrievable. He thought that basically his generation was almost completely spent, and that it is in young people that the real Nazi revolution would be taken forwards. So the beginnings of Hitler's domestic political programme, which were based around the lessons that he drew from Germany's defeat in 1918 and its subsequent humiliation thereafter. And Hitler and many of the other leading Nazis would continually return back to the nightmare of 1918 and ask themselves, why did Germany lose? What possible explanation can there be? And for many on the German right, the explanation had been a social explanation, and that Germany had not been defeated on the battlefield. Instead, Germany had been defeated on the home front. Not only had there been as we talk about the kind of the stab in the back conspiracy theory, that kind of Jewish Bolsheviks and agitators had caused a revolution and brought the country down, but also on the home front, in Hitler's eyes, there had been what the Nazis referred to as social ballast. There had been useless eaters, the kinds of people who were either work shy or disabled or mentally ill or alcoholic, or the kind of the riffraff that Hitler believed that nature would normally have weeded out through natural selection, but processes such as state socialism and liberalism had preserved the welfare states, ensuring that people didn't starve, that kind of thing. And that these useless eaters had been part of the reason why Germany had gone into decline during the First World War, perhaps due to a weakened racial stock, or perhaps due to the fact that resources were being expended on them instead of fighting men at the front. Of course, these ideas are kind of ludicrous and absurd and incoherent and not really based on any empirical evidence. And offensive and odious though they are, it's important for us here as kind of, shall we say, intellectual historians to try to understand the argument, to, no matter how kind of absurd it is, to understand and interpret what was believed, because in the full kind of events of the Third Reich, these ideas and beliefs have a significant impact. Hitler greatly admired Allied propaganda. He believed that it had had an immense contribution in winning the war for the Allied powers. Noakes and Pridham write, the main lesson drawn by Hitler, and in this he merely echoed the views of leading military commentators such as General Ludendorff, was that wars had ceased to be simply the province of professional soldiers. They were now fought between whole nations. As a result, they required the total mobilization not only of a nation's military and economic resources, but also, above all, its morale. Hitler believed that morale, national unity and national identity was the most decisive factor. In his perspective, the biggest defeat that Germany had suffered wasn't on the battlefield, but it was on the imposition on the German people of an entirely new ethos, that being the broadly social democratic principles of the Weimar Republic and its dominant parties. In Hitler's distorted view, liberalism, which emphasised the rights of the individual over the life of the community, the nation, the Volk, was an anti-German concept, and the development of democracy, which subordinated the creative or the heroic individual to the mass, and Marxism with its advocacy of social conflict and class war. These had been foreign ideas injected into Germany, which had been used to undermine it. If you ignore the fact that obviously Marx was a German assimilated Jew, if you ignore the fact that liberalism was alive and well in Germany a century before the end of the First World War, and if you ignore the fact that the entire course of German history between 1815 and about 1848 was one of attempting to build democratic, liberal institutions in Germany, then perhaps you would have the basis for Hitler's worldview. But you have to be entirely selective here and edit out huge chunks of German history where liberalism, the rights of the individual, the development of democracy, and also of socialism were entirely of a piece with Germany and Germanness itself. Again, in Hitler's own very warped thinking, if one denied that race was a significant defining factor of a nation, one was essentially playing into the hands of the Jews, who had no, in his view, national or ethnic loyalty. They were cosmopolitan. You could find Jewish people all around the world, and they had no tie to anywhere, and they were always secretly plotting to destroy countries like Germany, in his view. And also, any kind of internationalism that the Weimar Republic had displayed was simply interpreted in Hitler's view as a lack of patriotism during the war. The social democratic parties' internationalism had led to the development of pacifistic ideas, which once again, on the home front, undermined the army and led to defeat. Much of this was a kind of a diversionary activity. Much of this rhetoric was an attempt to ignore the reality that Germany had been defeated on the battlefield. It was defeated on the battlefield, and then the war was ended by a revolution. The German working class and German sailors and soldiers overthrew the Kaiser, ending the Kaiser's war because of the crippling food shortages in Germany. Another one of the culprits in Hitler's eyes were the pre-war governments that were entirely weak in his eyes and had allowed these unnatural ideas, these liberal and socialist and democratic ideas, to embed themselves in Germany. And the danger, what they had done is they had corroded the idea of national identity in his eyes. Noakes and Pridham write, owing to the weakness of the pre-war governments, these unnatural ideas had exercised a pervasive influence over the previous decades and had deeply entrenched themselves in German society and culture, sapping the national will. To restore German unity and morale, therefore, would now require internal reforms. First, the democratic system of Weimar must be overthrown and replaced by a dictatorship. And secondly, the new regime must then create a new social order in which class conflict and ideological cleavages would disappear and be replaced by a sense of national solidarity and by a commitment on the part of every individual to put the interests of the nation before self. The concept used by the Nazis to describe their social model was the national or people's community, Volksgemeinschaft, which would be created by the Nazi movement and whose interest would be expressed through Hitler's leadership. Like almost all Nazi ideological concepts, it was by no means original. Indeed, it was a cliché among the German right during the Weimar Republic as a counter-model to the class society diagnosed by the left. So Hitler believed that such huge changes needed to take place in order to restore German national identity and to restore the concept of Germanness altogether, that nothing short of a revolution could be countenanced, the overthrow of democracy. And then the overthrow of democracy is really the prelude to a kind of a social construction. And the idea of placing the idea of the community or the nation before that of the individual. Hitler was not a believer in the individual at all. Much as Hitler was an anti-intellectual and didn't believe really in the value of intellect, simply believing in the importance of will, he also did not see that the individual really had much of a role in society at all. Hitler believed that individual pleasures were something that were kind of antithetical to Nazism, that struggle, sacrifice and war in the pursuance of racial greatness was what individuals are for, and that the German people, it was important for them not to become too pampered, too indulged, too well looked after. Hitler thought that shortages during the rearmament period were probably a good thing, and the German people needed to know about hardship and privation to toughen them up, because the war that he had planned would be a period of immense hardship and of potential shortages, and that the German people would rise to the challenge, and the reward would be territory in the east. I mean, Hitler did envisage there being a kind of an attractive post Second World War standard of living for most Germans, but that would be gained as a result of plunder, of conquest, of the action of the German master race seizing territory in Russia. And that would be the test of German racial stock. That's how German living standards would rise. The idea that German living standards would simply improve through kind of general consumerism during the 1930s did not sit well with Hitler. Always quite the hypocrite, Hitler had a very pampered standard of living during the 1930s. He was very ill-suited to the hardships and the work commitment during the war. His own personal schedule is famed for its indolence, and he enjoyed all the things that, particularly the royalties of Mein Kampf, could buy him. He enjoyed many of the accoutrements of modernity, automobiles and cine projectors and all these nice, useful new things. And German living standards do fluctuate throughout the 1930s. There are brief moments where overall they improve, but for much of the 1930s there is very little kind of improvement from the Great Depression years 1929 to 33. So the thinking behind Volksgemeinschaft was that membership of the nation should transcend class differences. It wasn't an idea based in class equality of redistributing wealth. More, it was a case that a member of the upper classes and a member of the working classes, whilst they might not live the same kinds of lives, could still look upon one another as being as German as the other, and as being part of the process of sacrificing and serving in the interests of the greater racial body. Of course, as in the normal run of things, the wealthy of Germany arguably sacrificed less overall than the poor did, and had the opportunities to make sure that they faced fewer of the privations of war until after about 1943. The prototype of this Volksgemeinschaft lay in the idea of the Bergfried, or peace within the fortress, the spirit of 1914, when social conflict in Germany was temporarily set aside for about 18 months to 2 years until 1916, in the interests of unity and national unity and nationalist fervour during the initial months of the outbreak of war. The big domestic goal of the Nazis was to recreate this idea of the united nation that was also eager for war. Many of them recalled fondly German enthusiasm for war, and it's no small irony that in 1939, when Hitler tours Berlin on the 1st of September, there are no crowds on the streets cheering for his new war with Poland, only worried and concerned citizens making themselves scarce. And the German nationalist right was obsessed with recreating this spirit of 1914 and obviously trying to avoid the outcome of 1918, which haunted them like a spectre. Okay, I'm going to finish there. I hope you found that useful and interesting. I'll catch you on the next podcast. My apologies, we've been a bit slow in putting podcasts out. I had some kind of rather irritating summer virus for a couple of weeks, but we'll be back on it now in the run-up to September, and we'll be having hopefully a couple of interesting interviews coming up soon as well. Anyway, thanks very much for listening, and if you can support us on Patreon, do find us on the Explaining History Patreon page, and I'll catch you on the next podcast. All the best, bye-bye.